Episode 89. Properly read, the Bible is the most potent force for atheism. This is Matthew, and in this episode I welcome Tim and Arron as guests to discuss the idea that when understood in its proper context, the Bible is a potent source for atheism. I genuinely love this discussion, and I loved it even more during the editing process. I was initially hesitant about the topic because I was not convinced by the premise. But Arron won me over. I loved having Arron on because he asked me some direct and probing questions about things I'd not thought over for a very long time. And I appreciate him making me do that. This really was a lesson in being modest and open-minded. For that I thank him. Additionally, Tim has a bit of an abrasive reputation in some circles. But that's undeserved, as this discussion will reveal. I appreciated Tim's approach and his willingness to be personal at times. During this conversation, there is reference made to the discussion that I recently had on Unbelievable. At the time we recorded this, the recording was scheduled but had not taken place. We also skirt over Jesus' Methodicism in this discussion. It is a topic I want to cover, and so I will invite both guests back for that topic. If that doesn't work out, I will find another way of covering the subject. As always, please see the show notes for links to items raised and send any feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. We've got a foursome this time, which is the first time for a little while. So Andrew and I, your usual hosts, sitting in the chairs, and we've got two guests this time, people who have never been on this show before. So this is a bit of a treat. Firstly, a name that you guys probably aren't familiar with, but a name which I've become familiar with over the past month or so. We're actually doing this show because of a comment that he made. So Arron, welcome. We're talking about how properly read the Bible is the most potent force for atheism. That's a title that our listeners have seen. That's the title that you suggested. So tell me about yourself and why you think this is a title worth talking about.
Sure, that's the idea. Well, I mean, January's coming up and the birthday of Isaac Asimov and Science Fiction Day and all that stuff. And the idea that sparked interest for the people, for at least two or three of the people who were here, was Isaac Asimov's idea that if you read this thing properly, this Bible, it is the most powerful goad to atheism that you could probably come up with. That was the idea that sparked the original interest and the reason for this conversation in a way, right? That's what got us here. Okay. My name is Arron. As you said, Arron Ricker. There's no reason why anybody should know who I am. I'm a biblical scholar. And because I am not a Christian by any stretch, I am currently a lexicographer. The humanities are not doing so hot in North America right now. And so that means that more and more religious studies jobs are getting squished. If you want to teach religious studies, if you want to teach biblical studies or something, you're going to end up in a school that's affiliated with a church or that has some kind of faith commitment or at least a cultural connection, and there's no way I'm going there. So I'm what you might call alt-ac now, I guess. I'm using my Hebrew and Greek more than I ever did, but I'm working on dictionaries instead of actually teaching people about religion right now. So you are exactly right not to know who I am at all.
Excellent. Well, let's hope that we change that anyway. And my second guest is somebody who will be more well known to our listeners, certainly somebody who's been on my radar for some time. And I know of him. I certainly know he's popular with a great many Christians, possibly more popular with some Christians than with atheists. But if you haven't worked out who that is, welcome on to Still Unbelievable, Tim O'Neill. I genuinely never thought that I would get you on, but I made an ill-advised comment on Twitter. Somebody tagged you. You jumped in on the conversation. Arron got involved somehow, and we ended up having this conversation. So well done for that idiotic thing that I did. Welcome to Still Unbelievable, Tim. Tell us about yourself.
Sure, thanks Matthew, and thanks Andrew as well. I'm Tim O'Neill. I'm not a scholar. I'm more of a hobbyist, but I'm the author of the History for Atheists blog. And History for Atheists is aimed at atheists. And it's basically, the premise is, look, if you're going to make arguments about history, the history of religion and the Bible, you kind of need to get your facts straight. And those are things that I've studied over many years, and I don't pretend that I'm presenting original research or my scholarship. All I'm doing is curating the research of actual scholars, people like Arron, and getting my fellow atheists to make sure that when they are talking about this stuff that they're actually checking their facts and not just talking about it. I'm not sure if I'm more popular with Christians than atheists, but I know that there are many atheists who read my stuff and say, okay. And I get emails like this all the time. Thanks for your article. I did think that Christians burned down the Great Library of Alexandria, and now I know that's not true. Mm-hmm. But I also have a pushback from people who like to cling to the historical myths and misinterpretations that I talk about and get very angry with me. And also, unfortunately, in a way, many of my audience actually are Christians who say, look, we were right about this stuff. And I have to say, yeah, but you're wrong about other stuff as well. Yes. I just don't emphasize that on my blog. So if I do have lots of Christian fans, I may lose many of them through your podcast. And I look forward to doing that.
Okay, well, let's see if we can rectify the balance there then. You do make a good point there. Nobody has got the absolute claim to all of the truth. And we should be humble enough to be able to accept that. And if we make an ill-advised comment, we should say, yep, I barfed there. I should be more careful about how I say it. I should be less sloppy in my thinking when I'm going to say something publicly. Unfortunately, I have a habit of being quite sloppy at times. And I'm sure people who have listened to 90 odd episodes of Still Unbelievable, they'll be able to find some sloppiness in there. reasonpress@gmail.com. That's how you let me know when I've been sloppy, and I'll do my best to work it out. So, Tim, on the subject of properly reading the Bible and it being the most potent force for atheism, where do you stand on that premise?
Well, I'm always cautious about absolute statements. So is it the most potent force? Don't know. But I suppose the reason I was interested in this topic is a personal one. I was raised a Christian. I wasn't a terribly fanatical Christian, but if you'd asked me at the age of 15 or 16 what I believed, I would have said, yeah, I believe in God. And I do believe that Jesus was God in human form, and I believe the major tenets of Christianity. But I then found myself one day, and there's a particular moment where it all began to change, sitting on the sidelines of a conversation between a fundamentalist Christian and an agnostic at high school. Now, neither of them were particularly sophisticated debaters on this topic, but I was interested in what he had to say because I'd never heard anyone say it before, because she kept saying, Jesus said this. And he would say, how do you know? Mm-hmm. She would say, Jesus did that. And he would say, how do you know? And she kept saying, because it's in the Bible. And he'd say, who wrote the Bible? And she said, eyewitnesses who were there. And he would say, how do you know? And he would say, look, where did the manuscripts come from? How have they changed? And these are questions I'd never heard asked before at the age of, 17. And I didn't think she gave very good answers. In fact, her answers were terrible. So here I was at that point, really on her side, even though I found her highly irritating, and I really liked him. He was a pretty cool guy. But I didn't have the answers. And I thought, well, I'm going to go away and study. As a young fellow who was already quite interested in ancient medieval history and was starting to understand how history is studied, I thought, I'm going to go away and I'm going to do the study so that if anyone challenges me the way he challenged her, I'll be able to answer those questions. It didn't quite work out that way. And I went away and did several years worth of study. And by the end of it, I was an atheist. I'm not sure if studying the Bible made me an atheist, though. I think probably doing philosophy at university was probably more responsible, which is why I'm hesitating a little bit on the premise. But it certainly made me a non-Christian. Because, as perhaps we'll get into, I would argue, and I can see Arron is nodding vigorously here, I would argue that once you understand these texts as ancient texts, not as the Bible, because there isn't such a thing as the Bible is just a collection that we put together hundreds of years later. Once you understand that, it all kind of falls apart. And all the desperate attempts by Christian apologists to try and keep it together just look weaker and weaker the more you understand this stuff. So that's why I do accept the premise up to a point. I think if you read the Bible not as a believer, but as a critical historian, you start to see something very, very different.
It's interesting that, and I think I'm probably more on your side on that, Tim, because my journey from Christianity, from very fundamentalist Bible accepting, Bible literalistic Christianity, my journey out of that to atheism wasn't reading the Bible and going, oh, I suddenly no longer disbelieve this. The contents of the Bible needed to be challenged for me. And for that, the way I did that was by gaining a better understanding of science. And for me, the premise is a better understanding of science makes people atheists, because that was my journey. But now when I go back and read the Bible, I go, why did I ever believe it that way?
Yeah, we share the same story there to some extent, Matthew. So I did some time in seminary. I can read a little Greek. Arron, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so we can't talk Hebrew. Well, you can, but I won't be able to join. I do wonder, like you, Tim, whether the Bible is the most powerful force for making atheists. I tend to think that if there were better science education all over the world, not just the United States or Canada or Australia or the European Union, where Christianity is strong, pick the Middle East, any of the Asian countries, places where you might have strong Islamic traditions. I tend to think that if we had better science education all over the world, that would be the most potent force for fighting religious dogma. Now, we don't. And so we can only address the question that is at hand, which is reading the Bible the most potent force for creating atheists? Maybe the answer is yes, though I tend to think that there could be a more potent force if we had a different set of commitments.
Sure, but Andrew, I'd challenge that a little bit, because I think the dichotomy between, you've got religion on one side and you've got science on the other. And if you understand science better, then you'll end up rejecting religion. I think this is kind of a premise which has grown up, particularly in the whole new atheist movement. The religion and science are diametrically opposed ways of looking at the world. And the problem with that is that there are a great many deeply religious people who are also highly scientifically literate. My father was one of them. Right, so
that's why I was careful to say religious.
I know what you're saying, but I think it's more that a better understanding of science will help you to leave or to walk away from a particular form of religion, one that takes a fundamentalist reading, for example, and uses it to explain everything in the world. Whereas I don't come from a fundamentalist Christian background. I come from a non-literalist background. And so when someone says, well, look, Genesis isn't true, therefore the Bible is crap, my father would simply say, well, who the hell says Genesis is literally true? Only idiots think that.
Right. So that was actually why I was careful to say, or at least I think I said, religious dogma.
Sure. Okay.
But now, to be fair, I don't know. It's what I intended to say. I can't even look back in my head at the moment and decide whether I used the word dogma. But I will say this: we're probably on the same page there. If I didn't say religious dogma, it was in my head, and I accept the correction.
Sure, but look, my father did believe in religious dogma. He was quite a dogmatic believer, far more than I was when I was a believer. So this is why I'm just a little bit cautious about science education. Is a better way to get people to become an atheist. I think it's probably a better way to get people to walk away from, as you say, a particular type of dogmatic religion which requires literalism. But there's a whole
explore this, right? That's
right. But there's a whole long and deep tradition within Christianity, the Catholic tradition and the Orthodox tradition in particular, that was never biblically literalist. That's a new thing. That's actually quite a Protestant thing, and it's actually a very American thing. So we have to be a little bit careful about making it too simplistic.
And the shape of it is definitely new. Yes. I mean, Asimov is not here, so maybe I could jump in. Defend him a little bit, because he didn't just say reading the Bible, he said properly read, right?
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure if you could call him up, I don't even know if you want to, because I don't know how he's doing in terms of Me Too and all this other stuff, for heroes of the ancient past. But if you could call him up, I'm pretty sure that he would say, properly read includes the philosophical maturity that you're talking about, Tim, right? Properly read includes openness to science that people that you're talking about, Andrew, where it changes the way that you look at the text. And so you end up seeing it as an expression of something human. And when you do that, when you see it as an expression of something human, it can, from a generous point of view, it can be nice to see, oh, look, this is what humans are like. Oh, look, this is how humans make meaning. But if you're already a Christian, it can also really start deconstructing some things for you, right? If you say, this is a human document, these are human phenomena of community development, it changes the message pretty radically. So maybe that's where he would say philosophy and the science are going to help you if looking at the Bible is going to be your main tool for pushing atheism ahead. And maybe also just because, like I think all four of us here, you start out with Christianity being expected as your default. Yeah. And so you have the Bible given as this thing that's supposed to be good and it's supposed to have truth and so on. If you learn to read it, not assuming that it's right and you're wrong, if you learn to read it as a human document, then you're coming out of that default. So that could be a way of salvaging some of Asimov's promise that reading the Bible properly is the number one resource.
Right. And sadly, the good doctor died back in the early 90s.
Okay.
We can't have him on the show. But
yeah, it's going to be hard to have him, unless, of course, the Christians are right.
Yes, that's them again one day. But Arron, I think you've nailed it there. One of the things that fundamentalist Christians in particular like to do is to get you to not read other stuff other than the Bible. You know, if you just read the Bible, then it becomes this sort of self-enclosed paradigm. And it means that I was often baffled when I first realized this, that the Bible wasn't what Christians claimed. And in my great confidence at the age of about 20, thought I'd confront some fundamentalist Christians with some of the things I knew, and it just bounced off them. And I was quite baffled. I was saying, well, look, here the Bible says this, here the Bible says something else. That can't be true. Here Jesus says that people in his generation are going to see the end of the world come, and he was wrong. Mm-hmm. And I thought that they would be astounded. Instead, they just flipped through their Bible and found another way to interpret that.
Yeah.
And that's because we weren't reading the Bible the same way. I was reading it in a historical, critical way, saying, okay, this text was written at this time. This text was written in another part of the Roman Empire at another time. You can't reconcile them. They're not talking to each other. But in the Christian mindset, they are.
Is this fair? Would it be fair to say that you were looking at it the way that you would responsibly look at almost any old sacred text?
Ancient text. Any ancient text.
Any ancient text. And they weren't able to look at it, even for a minute, just to put on those glasses just for a minute and say, what if I try to read it like almost any ancient text just for a minute?
When people talk about the Bible as a book, I always correct them and say it isn't a book. It's a library. It's a collection of texts. But they see it as a book. They see it as one single thing, which it didn't become until, say, sometime around about the late 3rd, early 4th century.
It's not even finished for some people, right? You have the Mormon Bible adding, and you have,
What you guys have just done, though, is you very eloquently described my own upbringing. I was brought up in a missionary environment in Zambia in the 70s and 80s, and it very much was so. What the Bible says is true. Thou shalt not question that. And here it is. And one of you mentioned deconstruction earlier, and my deconstruction had multiple stepping stones through that before I eventually fell off the wagon, so to speak. But one of them was this realization that this literal young earth Old Testament simply can't exist. So now what do I do with it? And what that precipitated was a collapsing of the narratives of key moments in the Old Testament that I understood. The creation of the Garden of Eden being the obvious one, but it's not just that. You've got the Tower of Babel, you've got the global flood, you've got the escape from Egypt, and you've got all these key moments that start falling away. And maybe that's me falling into this premise of learning to read the Bible more properly and going, now what do I do?
What did you do?
I became an atheist.
Well, but I mean, what did you do with, let's say, the story of the flood or something, or the story of the genocides in Canaan? What did you start to do with them?
Well, I start to understand that they weren't true as written, which then the next question then becomes, well, which bits are true, which are the bits that are safe.
Oh.
And it got to the point where I couldn't answer that question. There's so little extra biblical detail that some of these really old stories, like Joshua and the city of Ai and things like that, there's so little modern archaeological detail surrounding events like that it's impossible almost to pull any truth out of that story at all. So I came to the conclusion that if I know that the critical bits are false and I can't trust any of the others, then is there any safety whatsoever in accepting any of the story as true? And I effectively went, no. And I think that was the problem for me. And
Ditto over here. The question is, do I have a good reason to believe any of it? And eventually, for a lot of us, we say, no, I don't have a good reason to believe basically any of it.
Yeah, yes. And
I think the word true here is actually quite important. And I'm going to be, come at it again from a historical angle. When you say I came to the conclusion, Matthew, that I couldn't believe that any of it was true, I think what you're talking about there is sort of epistemological truth. So well, actually, it's so much of it has now been revealed to me to probably not actually be real. That what foundation do I have to believe that any of the conclusions, the theological conclusions that are based on it, are actually real, are actually factual, and that's why you ended up an atheist. One of the things I do find, though, is that there is a genuine connection between people who come from a fundamentalist, literalist background, go through your journey, and end up in a position of hyper-skepticism where they also say none of this stuff happened at all. So I spend a lot of time on my website debunking Jesus mythicism, the idea that there was no historical Jesus at all. And this is the argument that's often used. Well, he didn't walk on water, and he didn't raise people from the dead. So how do we know any of this stuff is true? How do we know he even existed? And it sounds like a valid argument, but actually from a historical point of view, it doesn't work like that. So when we talk about it not being true, theologically true, sure. Does that mean necessarily that nothing in the Bible actually happened? That's another question.
That would be hard.
Hold on.
And I would say that even though we can't know that there was a historical Jesus, that's actually the best conclusion. Now, whether or not he walked on water and rose from the dead and all that stuff, they're separate questions, and very different answers to those.
And I was purposely staying with the Old Testament for my bits. Yeah, the Gospels is more problematic, and the way I feel about the Gospels and certainly Jesus is a little bit more nuanced than what I've been describing. If we go back to my city of Ai example, the whole Joshua walking around the walls and blowing trumpets and the walls falling down, we can pretty much confidently rule that part of the narrative out. Was there once a city there that was destroyed in a battle? Well, maybe. But if you take the miraculous bit out, then a city that transitioned into a regional powerhouse and then got destroyed again in a battle, well, that happened throughout history. Why does it matter? It's of so little importance, it's irrelevant to the story.
Right. Exactly. Well, it seems that you've found a new way to read it. You found a new way to read that story. It's a theological sort of embroidery on a kind of thing that happens all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Asimov would say you're learning to read that right.
So I'm going to end this episode agreeing with the premise. I think that's the road I'm on already.
I'm still not there. In fact, I'm not sure that we're not the wrong way around on it. In order to make room for religion in my own life. By the way, Tim, I think you're right that a lot of fundamental evangelicals who walk away have an almost knee-jerk reaction to the historicity of Jesus and all of that sort of thing. And I will tell you that I was a conservative, but not an evangelical, though I was definitely a fundamentalist. So the tradition that I grew up in didn't accept modern-day miracles, as a for instance. So if you're familiar with that kind of thinking. But my question now, and where I am based on my understanding of the way the world works, is for me to accept that there is a God. So let's get past the word religion and just talk about God for a moment, or any God, right? I have to say that for me, A thing that cannot be proven to exist cannot itself be a cause. And with that in mind, then, without a demonstration that a God exists, you'll have a tough row to hoe to get me to accept any religious tenets based on the conclusion that that God does exist.
Sure, but you're in pure philosophical. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with what you just said, but you're in pure philosophical territory there.
Oh, so, I don't think I am, and here's why.
Yeah.
Show me your God. I'm not making a philosophical statement. I'm making a concrete statement about evaluation of properties of a thing that exists.
Yeah.
If you can show me
You
God,
don't think that sounds like philosophy?
What's that?
You don't think that sounds philosophical?
That's not what I said. I didn't say that it didn't sound
again.
philosophical. What I said was,
Okay.
show me your God. I don't think that sounds philosophical at all. It doesn't sound any more philosophical than show me your red Corvette.
Okay,
That might just sound ignorant to them, though.
Yeah, I think my point, and I think Aaron's making the same point. What I'm saying when you're saying you're in pure philosophical territory there is you're not actually using another premise. For example, you're not drawing on, for example, stuff in the Bible. You're making an argument that's based on, well, if then. That's philosophy. I think, and nothing wrong with that. I came to my atheism largely through thinking things through that way. But I think back to our point about the Bible, one of the ways I looked at the Bible once I started to think that way was, well, these texts, are they actually telling me about a being that existed, or do they seem to be folklore of a kind that I find in all sorts of other religions? And the answer was they look a hell of a lot like folklore. The thing about gods is that they bear an uncanny resemblance to the people who believe in them. This is why Vikings had gods who liked, getting drunk and fighting and having sex, because that's what Vikings did. And the God of the Old Testament is very much a Near Eastern Iron Age potentate who demands obedience and offerings, and in return gives protection. It's not too difficult to look at that and think, this does seem to be a story that people are telling themselves about themselves. And one of the ways that I came to that conclusion once I came back to the Bible after years of studying other religions is this is just folklore. I'm not saying it doesn't have profundity. I'm not saying it doesn't have wisdom, but it is effectively folklore. It's traditional folklore, which has evolved. And this is why the God that, say, Matthew, when you're talking to our mutual friend Justin Brearley, his God is a very Justin Brearley shaped God. He believes in a kindly English gentleman who is quite empathetic and wise. He believes in a Justin Brearley shaped God. Most people do. They believe in a God that is effectively reflections of themselves. But I think you can get to that by looking at the Bible, by realizing that that's what you're seeing.
Well, it could at least be a tool. It sounds like you're saying that realizing that when you look at the Bible and you look at the different gods, by the way, there's not just one God in the Bible.
Yeah, that's right. There's
so many divine beings in the Bible. Yeah. But when you look at it, you think, oh, that's exactly what you would expect from someone writing in this time and place. Exactly. That can mean something to you if your ears are open for it. When you notice, oh man, that looks exactly like what you would expect. And then if you talk to this nice English gentleman about his God, and it turns out to be a nice English gentleman God, you think, that's what you would expect. That realization in itself, for a thinking person, should have some weight to notice, oh, that's exactly the God you would expect them to make up. Oh, man, what have I been reading here?
Yes, exactly.
So there's a very important question then in all of this is, how do we know if we're reading the Bible properly? And how do we differentiate between a bastardized reading and a proper reading? Because one of the questions that plagued me after I got to this point of challenging the narratives in the Old Testament was, now that I've rejected those as literally true stories and I've started poking at other parts of the Christian narrative, where do I stop? And somebody else who had never been a Christian believer asked me that very question, and I had no answer. Where do I stop reinterpreting these passages as mostly fictionalized with elements of historical reality that I can't really get to? Where do I stop, and where do I get to a passage that might actually be more true than not? How do I know the difference?
I've got some thoughts on that, but I know Arron will, so I'll let you answer, Arron.
Well, first of all, I'd want to know why it would matter. Just because, like we said earlier, the fact that there definitely does seem to have been an executed teacher by this name, Jesus, it doesn't mean that the part that matters to all the Christians is true. Can you tell me why it would matter to you which parts maybe really did happen?
Because at that point in my life, I was struggling with the Christianity that I had, because I knew that the fundamentalist, literalist, young earth Christianity that I was familiar with had to go. And I had to replace it with something or nothing. And so the reason why it was important was I needed to find a path to either a Christianity that I was prepared to believe, or Christianity is gone completely and there is nothing left.
Yep.
So that's why it was important.
I see. So you were trying to imagine a new Christianity, but it was important to you that some things be true in there?
Yes, because at that point I hadn't let go of the belief in God.
Okay.
So I still believed in God. And more importantly, I still deeply, to the root of my soul, wanted to believe in God. So I needed to find a hold, something that I could hold on to, that I could trust was true, because that would be my ticket to believing in God again.
I promise I'm not being difficult.
No, it's good. These are good questions, honestly.
Why would that require for you at that time?
Yeah.
Why would that require for you at that time that there be that the Bible gets some things right? Why couldn't it get almost everything wrong except for this subtle, transcendent message that you just sort of soaked in like the dew?
Yeah.
Like, why did you want it to be right about something, do you think?
Because I was still a feature of my indoctrinated Christianity.
Okay.
So for me, Christianity had to be true, and I needed to find out what I'd misunderstood. And becoming atheist at that point in time, for me, becoming atheist meant I'll become a wretched, immoral bastard who would have no control over his compunctions. That was the belief that I had. So at all costs, I had to stop becoming atheist, because I'd become a wicked, terrible person.
Can I say something? Can I say something real quick?
Yeah, please do.
I think that you're pointing to something super important there when you talk about what you thought you were choosing between. Right. Just because, one reason why I really appreciate what Tim does is that some atheists really do become insufferable bastards, right? Because we feel, and we're a whole bunch of white guys, mostly, statistically speaking, and they know something that their neighbor doesn't, and they can become absolute turds. And that's one reason why I love what Tim is doing, because it's important to have your facts right and to have an open heart and open head when you come to this, because people like you will think, well, I can't be an atheist because they're all shits.
But that's what fundamentalism does to you.
Right.
I was taught as a 5-year-old child that there would be atheists in the world that I would meet as an adult, and that is what they would be like. So from a very, very young child, I was taught and indoctrinated into complete fear and distrust of people who did not believe in Christianity. Yeah. And that was the baggage that I dragged into that process.
It's something that Isaac Asimov really needed to factor in, is that a potent force for atheism is meeting atheists who are obviously decent people and they're doing their best just like you, right? Like the person that Tim met, and he said he liked him. I think it's important that he liked him, that he was intrigued. I think it's important that he could then see himself maybe going down a philosophy road and changing his mind, because for a lot of Christians, they just can't see a world where they could maybe be an atheist. They might even lose their job. They might lose their families. They can't see that world. And I think that's much more important than being smart or, knowing particular facts, actually, is to be lucky enough to have it presented to you as something that's feasibly doable, that's actually a real option for you to do.
An important question about Christianity and about the three big monotheistic religions, and that is, where do atheists derive their value? Right? Because one of the big problems at least Christians in the States, I'm pretty sure Matthew and I have had guests from the UK that would ask the same kind of question. Where do we get our values? If we don't have, as it turns out, I think we do have some pretty objective values as atheists, but I get to them very differently. But one of the common religious questions is, without a set of objective values, what do you believe, and why does it matter? Can't the other guy just say, well, I don't believe like you do? And then they seem to be sort of saying we have this world of anarchy at the end. If you're an atheist and you don't have some sort of objective source for your values, then everything is the same. And we just have this world of anarchy at the end. And meeting atheists that have a strong sense of value, however they derive it, and can articulate it in some meaningful way, and having a commitment to those values that seems to be as strong as people with some religious background are committed to their values. That is an important step in accepting the atheists around you.
Yeah, I think well, I've had the situation several times over the years where I've been confronted by Christians who have asked me that question or versions of it. And it's interesting to see the reaction when I respond. I remember once I was talking to, it's weird, I was actually in a nightclub and I was talking to this girl because I kind of fancied her. This was a few years ago. Turns out she was not just a Christian, not just a Catholic, but a member of Opus Dei. Oh. And if anyone knows anything about Opus Dei, Catholic Church, they're regarded as radical weirdos by Catholics. Anyway. So what started out as me trying to chat up a rather attractive girl in a black cocktail dress turned into a philosophical conversation in a nightclub. But she asked me, well, where do you get your ethics from if you don't believe in God? She was basically saying you have no moral basis. And I said to her, okay, well, you think about this. If you're driving along the road in your car, you're in a hurry, you really want to get somewhere fast. It's important that you get somewhere quickly, in this scenario. And there's a little old lady crossing the road, and you will get there faster if you run her down in your car. Why don't you run her down? And she said, well, that would be terrible. Why is it terrible? Well, because she's a human being like me and empathy and so on. I said, fine. Now, you just answered the question without mentioning God once.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
She stopped. And she said, also because it's wrong, because God said so. And I said, and you can see the realization. It suddenly dawned on her that actually you can have a basis for morality. And then she said, but that's subjective. I said, why is a subjective or situational ethics, why is that less powerful for holding us together as a society than saying there's a man in the sky who will punish you? And actually, if the only reason you're not running the little old lady down is because you're scared of being punished by the man in the sky, I know that's a silly way of putting it, but if that's effectively what's going on, then does that make you moral or me more moral? I think it makes me more moral.
Yeah, I completely agree.
To put a tag on that has to do with the Bible too. If people really do want to have something that's not subjective, they're going to have to come up with something that doesn't contradict itself. They're going to have to come up with something that doesn't comply with moral standards that are clearly local to that time and place and horrible, about slavery and genocide and so on. So
and you've got to solve Erythro's dilemma.
The idea that subjectivity is on us as opposed to them who are picking and choosing and having to make certain passages more important than others is a weird argument to me. You're still clearly having to decide something, even if you think that your morality came from somebody up above you that you can't see.
So there's vastly more in the Bible about impurity due to various touching corpses and and nocturnal emissions and menstruation. Vastly more than there is anything about homosexuality, or anything that could be construed as being about homosexuality. But if you talk to a modern Christian, you'd think that the Bible is full of stuff condemning homosexuality. Yeah. And it isn't. Jesus had precisely zero to say in the reported teachings have anything to do with homosexuality. There are churches that are obsessed with this stuff. So Arron is absolutely right.
Well, come on now. You can hang your hat on Romans 1:17.
Yeah, that's right. That's
Did Jesus write that? You read your Bible properly, like Isaac Asimov said. Who wrote Romans?
Yeah.
And
the other passage that I will always use is the one in Leviticus.
Right.
But whenever they quote Leviticus at me about homosexuality, I always say, well, do you believe the whole of that passage? Yes. Okay, so we're meant to stone gays, are we? Oh, no. So what? You only believe the first bit about how it's bad. You don't believe the second bit, which is in the same passage, about how we're meant to drag them into a public square and throw rocks at them until they die. So they're picking and choosing between the.
Sorry. I was just, and you move 5 chapters further on, and you've got condoning of slavery. Do you believe
that's right?
Leviticus 25. I mean,
it's cherry pick.
This is why it's hard to have a straight face when they talk about you can't be subjective and you can't pick and choose and make moral decisions on your own. Well, of course you can. You have to. You have to.
And everyone does. Everyone does.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think that talking about the Bible in a particular way, very clearly, not like a total ass, but very clearly, and pointing out these things, I think that might be kind of one way to read the Bible properly with people that could help enlighten what's going on with some faulty reasoning there. Yeah.
But Matthew, your point before about how you were trying to find a way in which you picked your way through your newer understanding of the Bible, but maintained some kind of faith. And lots of people achieve that. One of my favourite biblical scholars, the New Testament scholars, is Dale C. Allison. And he and I agree on pretty much everything to do with Jesus as an apocalyptic preacher, a man of his time with a message that was about what was going on in first century Palestine at that point. But he's still a Christian.
Yeah.
And so you can find ways, but it just gets harder and harder. And this is why that more fundamentalist, that more sort of rigidly orthodox or even biblically literalist form of Christianity is so popular, because it's an absolute, and okay, you have to play some pretty sophisticated mental gymnastical games to maintain it. But if you can maintain it, it's an all or nothing way of looking at the world. How do I know anything? I just turn to the Bible. It gets much more difficult when you're starting to have to pick and choose and say, well, okay, that bit's not true, but this bit, this is true. That bit doesn't have philosophical or theological application to my life, but this bit does. It gets much, much harder, which is why fundamentalism says, well, either you believe, I've heard preachers say this, either you believe it all or you can't believe any of it at all. And this is why people, when they quite often move away from fundamentalist and literalist Christianity, slide to the other extreme. And this is why I end up arguing with a whole lot of people, Jesus mythicists, who have gone to the silly extreme, and actually behave very much like fundamentalist Christians, right down to the point where they've got holy books and preachers, and Richard Carrier says, and they're sitting there opening up the Richard Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus and quoting him chapter and verse, and like they might as well be in a pulpit. So it's a difficult
thing. Yeah. I don't want to land on Jesus mythicism just yet.
No,
it's fine. It's okay to touch it, but maybe as a teaser, maybe Tim, we could have you back and we can do a whole episode on Jesus mythicism if you're. Okay, maybe we can. I've certainly been accused of being the kind of atheist that you have just described. But I will say it now, I do not count myself as a Jesus mythicist, but I do skate quite close to that area. So it gets quite mucky. Christian's opinion of me gets quite mucky when it talks about that. But let's save that for another time. Here on Still Unbelievable, certainly when Andrew and I do our solo shows, or whether we have some of our more lay guests on, we get very, very spiky towards Christianity. I make no bones about that. I don't pretend that this is a nice, safe, Christian-friendly podcast. A lot of the time, we're not, and I'm okay with that. And I don't mind making a few Christian enemies. I'm pretty sure that most of my listeners here, or our listeners here on Still Unbelievable, are either people who are atheists and enjoy hearing this dialogue, or people who are on their way out and they need something to just help them to formulate these kinds of things. And the kind of emails I get that appreciate our content are those kinds of people. So I'm quite happy.
I have never been spiky to a Christian guest.
Oh, you to a Christian guest, yes. To a Christian guest, no, but we're responding to Christianity as an entity. But where was I going? But to flesh out my story a little bit more, into possibly to lead on to the point you were making there, Tim. My final exit, and I don't know if either of you two guys know the name David Jenkins from around about the early 90s. Late 80s, I think it was. He was the guy who hit major headlines here in the UK. He was the Bishop of Durham at the time. And he made the case that the resurrection of Jesus never happened, and that the resurrection was a metaphysical resurrection, in that Jesus is living on in the memories and in the stories, was what Jesus' resurrection really was. And the UK press went absolutely ballistic, and I was a late teenager, so maybe 19 years old kind of age when that happened. And I was devastated by that, absolutely devastated that a bishop in the UK could say something like that and could believe that. And then worse still, I went to home group with the pastor of the church. It was a Methodist church here in the UK. So it wasn't a pastor, he was a minister, whatever, the word doesn't matter. He affirmed that. And this was somebody who I looked up to, somebody who I thought was a really spiritual man. And he affirmed that as true. And so I had a double hit.
That it had a spiritual vibe to it, or it was purely a human phenomenon?
I don't know how to answer that.
Okay.
To be fair, Arron,
Okay.
he affirmed that Jesus' resurrection was not physical.
Not
there was no physical resurrection. That it was all in the memories and the stories of the people.
Okay.
And so I got double devastated that week, and it was a terrible, terrible time for me. So now we roll forward to when I've now questioned my Christianity and I've rejected these key stories from the Old Testament that I've mentioned. And so the point that I reached was that question: can I live with myself with that Christianity? And I basically said to myself, no, I can't. And I think what did it for me was, if these stories in the Old Testament I can't trust, and especially the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve, if Adam and Eve weren't created and didn't fall, and humans are just evolved apes who evolved from something that came before, then this whole concept of a point of sin, a moment of creation, God breathing life into humans, that point in time just doesn't make any sense. It's illogical. It can't have happened. And if that is fiction, then the point of Jesus' death is irrelevant, because there's no point of salvation, because there's nothing to be saved from. And that was where I reached. So I got to the point where the David Jenkins Jesus was irrelevant, because he didn't die for anything. He didn't die to save my sin, because there was no sin consequences to save me from, because the Garden of Eden narrative is false. So that was the route that I took. So I avoided the David Jenkins dilemma, because I'd rejected the whole concept of original sin. And so when by that point I'm going, well, there's literally nothing worth getting excited about. And so that was my out.
I think there are other people around who kind of were saying the same thing, or still are, who say the same kind of thing as Jenkins. In fact, there are literally millions of Christians who believe that kind of Christianity.
Yeah.
John Shelby Spong was the other. It was an American Episcopalian bishop. Wrote a book in the 90s called Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism, where he was arguing along very similar lines and talking about the resurrection event and talking about and mocking the idea of taking Bible stories literally. I mean, did Jesus, when he ascended into heaven, did he fly off into the air? Where did he go?
Yeah.
He rose physically from the dead, so is he still out there somewhere? So obviously it doesn't make any sense. I think Matthew and Andrew, you probably need to get a Spong or Jenkins style person on the show and maybe discuss how it makes sense to them, because I'm like you. I kind of got to that point and thought, well, okay, this doesn't make sense, and so I now no longer believe it. And I have spoken to people who believe in that kind of Christianity, and I don't quite get it.
No, me neither.
But that's again because I'm always looking at this stuff from a historical point of view, and so I went through a very similar process, I suppose, Matthew. But what happened was, once I worked out that Jesus was probably a Jewish preacher, an apocalyptic preacher, I then wanted to try and work out how much of the story was true. And I went through years of trying to come up with reconstructions of, well, this bit's probably true, but maybe not this bit. I've kind of given up on that these days. These days I sort of say, look, there are about 3 or 4 things I think we can say as historians are probably true. 1, he existed. 2, he probably came from Nazareth. 3, he had a brother called James. 4, he preached about the coming end of the world. And 5, he was crucified by the Romans. Other than that, I don't think we can say much about the guy. Then there's a big big potential category of things that might have been true. He might have gone to Capernaum and preached a particular parable, maybe, but we can't tell.
Yeah. He might have been at a wedding.
So
exactly.
that has been my problem with the Jesus story, Tim, is that whoever Jesus was, and like you, I think he probably existed, but whoever he was, he is as much legend today, in fact, more legend today than he was. Well, as time rolls on, he's more and more legend every day.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that there's an easy way to solve that problem. We don't have recordings of Jesus. We don't have videos of Jesus. In fact, Sai Baba is far better attested today than the Jesus that we have. And in part, it was that legendary quality that helped me walk away. Because how do you know? The Sermon on the Mount doesn't make sense as a sermon, right? No one stood on a mountain and said that thing in that way as a sermon. That's not new with me. So, what is it that we have about Jesus that gives us such commitment as a society, not individually, obviously, as a society? What is it that we have that gives us such commitment to that historical character? Interested in you guys' thoughts there.
Mm-hmm. Well, can I connect it to reading the Bible again? I'm pretty sure that part of the reason that we are where we are is because do you know Northrop Frye around the world, or is he just just for Canadians? This is something I've seen it in a few scholars, but I first saw it in an English literature guy, Northrop Frye. He said basically the Jesus of the Bible has been very successfully sealed off from the kind of questions that you might be asking right now, like did he really have 12 disciples, or did he actually visit this part of Canaan or whatever? He's been sealed off in a literary way, and part of the way that he's been sealed off is that he's always doing things that are predicted. He's always doing things that fulfill, right? He's always doing things that make him the Messiah that some audience is going to expect and need and want. And I think one way that reading the Bible properly, in Asimov's sense, can help is to notice that this Jesus that's in this Bible is sealed off from the kind of questions that we would ask, like how tall was he, or did he have bad breath, by these expectations of he's always meeting some criterion for being the Messiah. Everything he does, everything he says is fulfilling something or proving somehow to some audience that they meet an expectation, some kind of messianic expectation. And I think when you notice, I think even just noticing that nothing in this text tells me anything except for a kind of theological propaganda, I think even just noticing that it means something to a thinking person.
Yeah, and I think the thing about reading ancient texts is you have to read them in the context of when and how and why they were written. And unfortunately, when most people read the Bible, they don't. And so really, once you understand that the Gospels are not they're not newspaper reports, and were never meant to be. They're not documentary history. And this is the way both Christians and many atheists read them. Atheists read them and go, well, if we read this as a documentary history, it can't make sense. Look, he's riding on two donkeys at once. That's silly. Sure, of course it's silly, because it's not meant to be read that way. So, I mean, these are books of that are not saying Jesus did this. They're saying Jesus is this, and this is why a lot of the miracles and a lot of the particularly the infancy gospels, the Christmas story stuff, it doesn't make any sense as history, despite what Christians will try and tell you. It doesn't, and we could do a whole show on that. But it does make sense as theology, because what it's saying is, look at who he is, look at who he was, and look at who he is. And once you start to read the Bible, read the text of the Bible, we're going to stop talking about it as a singular book. Once you start reading them in context and understand them as genre, so understand what the Gospels are as a genre, and understand that they're not newspaper reports, they're not documentary history, then it starts to make a certain kind of sense. Doesn't mean you start to understand it. Doesn't mean that you then necessarily believe it. Obviously, I don't. And one of the things that I suppose worked for me, and this was even before I started to look into this stuff, for long and complicated reasons. I was sent to a Christian youth camp, and there was one guy who spoke at this camp, and I actually liked what he said. and he was talking about how he had gone back from last time he'd been to this camp and read a chapter of the New Testament every night before he went to sleep. I thought, I'll do that. So I actually did something that many Christians don't do. I read the whole New Testament, and I read it front to back. And immediately I began to notice stuff that I'd never noticed before, because most Christians don't do that. Most Christians go to church and a preacher or a priest or someone will stand up and they'll read a bit of the New Testament and then they'll expound on it. And most Christians are just getting snippets. I started noticing stuff in the New Testament that I'd never heard before. I read stories I'd never even heard before. I'd read sayings of Jesus and I thought, one, I've never heard that, and two, what the hell is he talking about? So it started to open my eyes a bit about a few things that I hadn't actually noticed before. And one of them also is that it tells the New Testament, the Gospels tell the same story in different ways. And I began to notice that. I began to notice that one Gospel will tell a story quite simply, another Gospel will be a much more elaborate version. And that's writ large in the resurrection narratives, where you go from young man next to an empty tomb to an earthquake and guards falling asleep and all sorts of drama. It's like, well, they both can't be true. Then when you realise that the Matthew account, the one with the earthquake, was based on the Mark account, the one with the young man next to an empty tomb, you have to realise that the author of Matthew is embroidering, he's adding, and he's doing it deliberately. He knows that he's writing a slightly different story to the one he's found in his source. So what's going on? Is he lying? A lot of atheists would say, oh, he's a liar. No, he's not. He's trying to get across a truth. But you've got to understand that he's not writing documentary history. Mm-hmm. And this gets back to the Bible read properly. Once you start to see all that stuff, you start to have a better understanding of why they are writing in this way, what that means, what the context was, who their audiences were, when they were writing. This is, again, is historical critical reading as opposed to theological reading.
Can I check on the clarification of what is meant by properly, because this is probably going to come up in the mind of my listeners. Yeah. I'm going to assume that by properly you don't mean fully knowing what the motives and the intentions are of the people that wrote it. What you mean by properly is that it is not intended to be literal, as you've just said, but it is a nuanced, random, varying collection of stories, possibly even evolved stories rather than written in one setting. And this mush and this mixture comes up with something that should never be literal. And understanding that is what's meant by properly, even if we don't know what the original motive was.
I might push back a little bit on the literal. I don't think it's true that just because Christians today favor non-literal readings, I think that's more about the failure of literal readings than about what Bible stories are all about, sort of in themselves or something like that. I think that an awful lot of people do take them literally, and I think that if we're trying to imagine what authors wanted, it's not always the best idea, but if we do imagine what they're wanting, I think sometimes they did want to say this is literally true. So
I don't want to overstate the point. I'm not saying the gospel writers were writing, purely sort of theological, allegorical work. But what I am saying is that it's multi-layered, and to simply read it on one layer is always a mistake. And this is something that actually early Christian writers recognized very, very early on. I mean, originally there were like 4 layers of exegesis, and the literal was the only one, and probably one of the least important. But Matthew, back to your question, what do I mean by properly? I mean by reading them critically rather than reading them for theological substantiation, which is the way that most Christians read it. But if you're reading them as ancient text, you read them the way you read any ancient text. I don't sit and read Tacitus and just go, well, Tacitus said this happened, that must have been how it worked. What I'm doing is thinking, well, okay, who was Tacitus writing for? When was he writing? What was the context? What was his audience? What was his purpose? What could he say? What couldn't he say? So when Tacitus is criticizing the Julio-Claudian dynasty, is that because that he's being highly objective there, or is it because he was sponsored by and friends with the next dynasty, the Flavian dynasty, who had problems with the predecessors who they had usurped the empire from? So this is about reading things in context, understanding authorial intention, and also understanding genre. because people writing history in that period weren't sitting and writing, post-Rankian modern objectivist history. They were writing polemic. They had an objective, and the same with the gospel writers. So you've got to understand the objective and the context, and that way you're going to have a better understanding of what the text means. And
Tim, you're going to have to forgive me. Every bit of that sounded like a sermon I could hear on Sunday morning in any Christian pulpit around the world, because look, forgive me, I'm not speaking.
I don't think they're talking from the same perspective as me.
Well, right, they're not. But every bit of that was, well, if you only understood the context, and if you only understood their original intent, and if you only get into their minds.
There's one snippet I think that you might not hear, is that to read it the way you would any other ancient text.
Yes.
I'm not sure. They might. Some might. In the United Church of Canada, they might. Yeah. But in the church down the road, they would not. Yeah. Because if you read it the way you would any other ancient text, then you don't.
I may have missed that if he said that.
Okay.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did say that.
That's actually the key point.
You're not assuming that there's something good to be recovered. You're not assuming there's a treasure under the dross. You're not assuming that when there's a problem, you're wrong. You know what I mean? When you read it as if it were any other ancient text, that might be key for me for properly reading.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. Yeah. Quick question, and that I wanted to get onto is, I love what you've said, Tim. I am absolutely on board with that, and I'm glad that you and Arron are on board with that. I wish I could say it as enthusiastically and succinctly as you, because I have a way of hashing my content in a way that makes me unattractive to Christians, and maybe that's my problem. So, which brings me straight to my question: is how do you guys have a suggestion on how we get that kind of thinking over to those who do take the Bible absolutely true? How do we reach them? How do we get them to think about it?
There's a little bit of quiet, so I'll go first. I think he said read in context, right? And Andrew jumped in and said, well, of course, almost any preacher is super excited to try this. I think that is a good foothold, actually. If you tell people, you don't really know what's happening here unless you read it in context, they will maybe start nodding with you, right? Because maybe they were about to tell you the same thing. You say, you don't really understand what's happening here until you read it in context. And at that point, you can maybe start laying in what would count as context for almost any other ancient text, right? So, for example, if you read a gospel, if you've only read one ancient hagiography, then you kind of haven't read any, because you don't know what you're looking at, right? If you only read one creation account like you did, or only one flood account, you don't know what you're looking at. And so part of reading properly would be reading the kind of things that those people were used to at the time. Reading the Bible properly would include reading and knowing about the kind of expectations that people had for books like this. And, well, not for books like this, usually for oral performances like this that came down to us as books, right? And so then when you say, yeah, let's understand the context. Good. So everyone's agreeing. We're going to understand the context. And then you say, well, how many apocalypses have you read? Have you read the Apocalypse of James, the Apocalypse of Zephaniah, the Apocalypse of Seth, the Apocalypse of... And if they haven't read any of those, then it's a chance to say, well, when you read the Apocalypse of John, you're going to miss out on some very important things of what's happening if you don't know what people expected from an apocalypse. If you read Revelation and you don't know what people expected from an apocalypse, you're going to be confused, and you might develop a beautiful special relationship to the book, but you're going to be out in outer space somewhere when it comes to the reality of what an apocalypse was. It would be like watching one movie only in your life, one of the James Bond movies, right? You could have such a meaningful relationship with that one James Bond movie, but your ideas of what's going on will be just out in outer space when it comes to what movies are and what James Bond movies do. You're not going to know why so many things happen. You're going to be confused by so many elements and characters, and it could be really meaningful to you and good for you. But if you want to talk about what it means in its context, you need to know about the history of movies. You need to know about the history of James Bond books and films. And you need to have seen a few other movies to really know what you're seeing. And I think that might be one way, at least it worked for me as a young person, to get people interested in reading it as if it were just another ancient text, to read it as an ancient text, as opposed to something special with a beautiful background of other ancient texts, right?
Yeah.
The exceptionalism where you have these beautiful ancient texts, and then you have the Bible, which is pretty much the only thing you pay attention to. And sometimes you refer to other things as context alone, merely context, if I can say it like that.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with what Arron just said. I gave up years ago trying to deconvert Christians. I went through a phase in my early 20s, maybe I often refer to as my obnoxious atheist phase. I grew out of it. Some people don't, unfortunately, and they make a career out of it. But anyway, I don't do it anymore. But if anyone does sort of try and get in my face and say Christianity is true, then I can usually counter by saying a version of what Aaron's just said. Probably the real turning point for me when it came to moving away from Christianity was one book, which was Geza Vermes, who was the late emeritus professor of Jewish studies at Oxford. And he wrote a brilliant book back in the early 1970s called Jesus the Jew. It wasn't a debunking of Christianity. In fact, it was a very scholarly, actually quite scholarly work of contextualization, where he would take a bit from the Gospels, and then he'll take some bits from the Talmud and from various Jewish apocalyptic works and various other bits and pieces and sort of say, here's the context. So he wasn't unique. He was just another Jewish preacher of this kind. Here's Jesus doing a miracle. Here's Hananiah ben Doza doing a similar miracle. Here's Ananias doing a similar miracle. This stuff was happening. This stuff was in the air at the time. Very, very quiet, simple, quite short, but extremely dense work, which actually revolutionized historical Jesus studies at the time, but also changed my life because I got to the end of it and thought, well, hang on. I didn't realize there was any of that context before. It's exactly what Arron was talking about. And then I went on the journey to actually understand that context better.
Awesome. Link in the show notes, listeners, rather. There'll be a link in the show notes to that book that Tim's just mentioned.
It could be useful for your conversation coming up with this person.
That's awesome.
This person who wrote Uninvented.
Yes.
Yeah. Just that kind of thinking could be maybe useful for that conversation, just because so many of the things that you sent along from the book, the ideas, were exceptionalist ideas. They were ideas that don't seem to understand that similar things were going on at the same time. They were ideas that apply one standard of reading to the Bible and another standard of reading to everything else. So taking context as seriously as they say they take it could maybe be something useful in talking to someone like this uninvented person.
Yeah. And
thank you for that.
Similarly, I mean, if you're reading the story of, say, Jesus being taken up into heaven, and you're not reading other stories of apotheosis, where, say, Romulus is taken up into heaven, if you're reading the stories of Jesus going out and teaching and performing miracles, and you're not reading Apollonius of Tyana and the Philostratus' account of him going around, traveling around, teaching and performing almost identical miracles. The problem with this is that this often gets, these parallels, these contextual parallels often get misused. And so the angry atheist types that I talked about before say, well, the Bible's just plagiarized from this stuff. That's not what's going on. But what is happening is that if you're looking in the context, this stuff was in the air. This stuff was around. And Jesus wasn't exceptional. The stories aren't exceptional. Once you understand that, then you get a better understanding of how these things came about and what they mean.
This is it. I mean, Christmas is coming up. Maybe you can talk to this person about the virgin birth, because he might say, oh, it's so unbelievable, it must be true, right? Or, do you know what I mean? Like, no one could possibly make it up because they'd know you wouldn't believe them. So therefore, it must be true. And this kind of weird, it's absurd, therefore I believe it move. But,
I know. I thought that kind of, it's so ridiculous, it must be true kind of thinking was reserved for science.
But this is it, though. If you know that at the time, somebody like Hercules in myth or somebody like Alexander the Great in propaganda, if you know that they had miraculous births too, spermless births, then you know that we're talking about readerly expectation. We're not talking about something unique that came out of nowhere, and now you have to either accept it or deny the whole thing.
Bart Ehrman has a lecture coming up that he's doing online, I think this month, on other virgin births in the ancient world. where he's making exactly this point. And it's not just sort of saying, that, as I said, it's not that Christianity copied this other stuff. It's just that Christianity was in a particular context where this stuff was being said. And if you don't understand that, then you're going to say, well, it's unique, therefore, and it's weird, therefore it must have happened. It's a stupid argument.
Yeah, it is. Andrew, do you have any thoughts before I go into the final questions?
Briefly. We have been chatting for about, just over an hour now. And we have used the word proper over and over and over. And one of the things that I want to say to the listeners is that it is not the four of us here trying to define what proper means. That work has and is being done every day by people who actually spend a lot of time thinking about how to reach good conclusions. So what do I mean by good? Because now it just sounds like I'm using the word proper all over again, right? But I'm not. By good conclusions, I actually mean conclusions that are testable, conclusions that are reproducible, conclusions that in the end help all of us make better decisions. It helps us predict the future. It helps us every day with whatever walk we're on. And so when we talk about proper reading, I dare say that at least among the four of us, we are not appealing to an internal special revelation. We're not asking you to simply take our word for what proper is. In fact, I think if we came back, the four of us, and we talked about a big word, epistemology, you'll have heard it here over and over and over, so some of you can press fast forward for the next 45 seconds. But if we came back and we talked about what we meant by proper, how to reach good conclusions, we would talk about historical methodology with Tim. We would talk about what it means to understand the heart of an ancient language with Arron. We would talk with Matthew about walks out of Christianity and what advised his thinking as he was reaching the exit. And so when we say proper reading today, friends, we are not talking about independent decisions that we four reached and we just happen to agree that atheism is in some sense the way we see Christianity now. Because atheism is just the answer to the question, is there a God, right? And I don't know how each of these guys would phrase their own atheism. But proper reading means that you cast away your fear. You get rid of not being able to read the counter opinion. And you actually do the hard yards in understanding what it means to think and think well. We don't have time for that. But when we say proper, there is a foundation. And whatever you take away from what I've said today, if this is the only thing you take away, lay the foundation for your own reasoning and do that first. And then maybe you have a hope of properly reading the Bible or your history textbook or your chemistry textbook or having better conversations with your wife or your friends or whoever. Because understanding is something that takes time and effort if you're going to do it properly.
Amen.
Okay.
Oh dear, I can see I'm going to get motivated into reading the Bible again.
Don't do it.
That was not my intent.
And all the Christians cheered. Right, so gentlemen, thank you so much. This has really been fun. I'm genuinely pleased that I had you both on. I really, really loved this conversation. So maybe we can work out a way of replicating something similar next year. This is fabulous. So one of the things that we're in the habit of doing here on Sermon Believable is asking our guests, especially when we're talking about the Bible and things Christianity, we normally just reserve it for Christians. But since you guys are so enthusiastic about the Bible, Arron first, do you have a favorite Bible character and who are they?
I don't, but I can tell you who's on my mind this week. It's the Son of Man in Revelation who has boobs. He doesn't have stay face. He doesn't have a chest. He's got mastoi. And to me, this for several reasons, this has been on my mind. This crazy, wild-looking figure, right? Everyone can agree that it's supposed to wow you and make you think that you're small, and it's supposed to push the boundaries of what's natural and so on. But what some people don't realize is that some of that pushing is that he apparently has mastoi. And it could mean several things. He could be competing with Roma from Rome. I don't know where you land on that, but it's been on my mind, especially in this time when I'm trying to figure out, along with everybody else, what I think about trans identity and sexual identity and so on. It's been on my mind, this crazy heavenly vision of the Son of Man guy with mastoi girl.
I am not familiar with that, so I am definitely going to be reading my Bible.
Please look it up.
Well, thank you, Arron. You've probably just blown the minds of half our listeners. Thank you so much for that. That's fabulous. Tim, I dare you to beat that.
That's going to be tough to beat, and I'm now having to go back and look at Revelation in the Greek because I hadn't noticed the mastoi, but there you go. Look, my favourite character, because I think he's crazy and weird and he doesn't quite fit, is John the Baptist. Because especially John the Baptist in Matthew and Mark, so the early Gospels, he gets different in John. But because what's going on with the Gospels is they're trying to fit him in because they think he's important, but he doesn't quite fit. So they're trying to make him out to be sort of like, oh, he's the guy who announces Jesus. But if you read, say, Mark, for example, he doesn't. He doesn't say, hey, this guy over here is the Messiah. He says the Messiah is coming, and then Jesus turns up, gets baptized by him. They don't even talk. And then Jesus goes away, and that's it. And then in the rest of Mark, he keeps popping up. But he keeps popping up as a kind of a skeptical voice. He's in prison at one point, and he sends messengers to Jesus and says, who are you? Are you the Messiah? If you're not the Messiah, when's he coming? So one, he's meant to be this guy who knows everything, but at the same time he obviously doesn't. And two, he's actually a bit skeptical about Jesus. Now when you get to John's Gospel, all that changes. In John's Gospel he says, here he is, this is the guy I was talking about, and he doesn't even baptize him, right? Because that's actually something that a superior does to an inferior. So John's Gospel kind of conveniently makes that bit go away. Matthew's Gospel has him say, hey, I shouldn't be baptizing you, you're the superior. And Jesus says, oh, no, this is how it's meant to be, which doesn't actually make any sense. So I love John the Baptist because he doesn't fit. And also I love the bit where they say to Jesus says, who do people say that I am? And he says, well, some say you're Elijah, come back from heaven. Some say you're John the Baptist. And this is after John the Baptist has been executed. And there's another bit where Herod says, he hears about Jesus and he says, this is John the Baptist risen from the dead. So there's even an idea that John the Baptist must have been around, that John the Baptist had risen from the dead, or at least could have. And then in Acts, they meet some guys in Greece who are baptizing people, and they say, are you baptizing them in the name of Jesus? They say, no, you're giving them the baptism of John. So John's sect continued after John's execution. So we've got a direct parallel between the Jesus sect and the John sect, except the John sect obviously died out, most likely. So I like John the Baptist because he doesn't fit and he's weird. He's saying things like, the axe has been laid at the root of the tree and, everything is going to be cleansed with fire. He's crazy. And he doesn't fit the gentle Jesus, meek and mild story at all. He's an apocalyptic weirdo. So I love John the Baptist. He also eats some locusts. I
was going to say, clearly all that diet of locusts and honey must have...
Locusts of old honey. And wearing that scratchy robe made out of a camel skin. I mean, if you've ever seen a camel skin, that would not have been comfortable. Yeah. John the Baptist.
Well, he's a good example because he points to what we've been talking about, because all those things look like echoes of Old Testament stuff, but they also show that Christians are trying to struggle with something that apparently actually happened. They have to figure it out.
John the Baptist baptizing Jesus didn't fit their idea of who Jesus was, so they have to keep changing the story to try and make it fit until they take the baptism out altogether.
Right.
So did John the Baptist exist as a real person?
Almost certainly. He's attested in Josephus, and that bit isn't a bit that seems to have been tampered with. Okay. And the whole reason he's in the Jesus story is because that he seems to have, as Arron just said, he seems to have been significant to Jesus. But they can't quite make him fit their conception of Jesus as being superior to him. So they're having to fiddle around with the story. Even to the point where they make them relatives at one point. Luke's gospel has them being It's often said cousins. It doesn't actually say that in the gospel. But they try and fiddle around with it that way and say, oh, well, he was Jesus' relative, which is almost certainly not true. Never gets mentioned again in that gospel or anywhere else.
I'm going a bit off script here, and I'm also very conscious of the time. So just very quickly then. So would it be fair to say then that in terms of what these apocalyptic preachers were like, is it fair to suggest then that John the Baptist is more close to the type of person they were than Jesus is?
No, I'd say they're both. Yeah,
okay.
I'd say they're both. If you particularly look at the early Gospels, they're saying the same thing. Bart Ehrman's written some very good books on this. Maybe I can come back on and talk about it, Matthew. But they're the same message. The end of the world is coming very, very soon. You've got to repent, cleanse yourself. Otherwise, you will be among those who will be cast into nothingness. They're saying the same thing.
Okay. You want to be very careful, of course, just because we're talking about reported speech. Right? It's the same issue for John as for Jesus.
Yeah,
true.
If he's the character of the apocalyptic preacher in your book, then he will say that kind of thing. But yeah, it really does seem like he's a good example, doesn't it? Of a kind of teacher that Jesus would have been. Again, that would have been relatively normal. And if you haven't looked at a bunch of them, you don't know what you're looking at for real.
Yeah, exactly.
Lovely. Thank you so much, gentlemen. This has been fabulous. Clearly, we could go on for ages. We'll work something out for 2023 about one or both of you again or whatever. We'll certainly do something. This has been absolutely great fun for me. Listeners, thank you so much for coming here. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I did. If not, where is your soul? If you have any questions you'd like to ask any of these fine gentlemen, it will be an excuse for us to get them back on again. reasonpress@gmail.com, same place you can catch us all the time. Thank you. You have been listening to Still Unbelievable, and until next time, be reasonable. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.